Manager for the Child Welfare Information Gateway, and I'm also the project coordinator for the National Resource Center for In-Home Services. On the behalf of the NRC for In-Home Services, we welcome you to the Fair Assessment and Intervention Response webinar. It's a collaborative approach to working with teens and families. Before we get started, our operator, Camille, will cover the logistics of today's webinar.
Thanks,
Camille?
Thanks, Cynthia. I will explain a few of the audio and video capabilities for this webinar. We will leave time at the end of the presentation for questions. There are two ways you can ask a question. In the control panel at the top right corner of your screen, there is a feature that allows you to raise your hand if you want to be recognized or type a question in the chat box. Feel free to use those features at any time. To ask a question over the phone, press star 1 on your telephone keypad. If you're using a speakerphone, please make sure your mute function is turned off to allow your signal to reach our equipment. Once again, to ask a question over the phone, it's star 1 on your telephone keypad. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the NRC In-Home Services website, along with today's PowerPoint presentation. Now, I will turn the meeting over to Robert Sawyer, a senior consultant for the NRC for In-Home Services. Rob?
Hi there. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, or good day, depending on which time zone you're in listening to this webinar. What we want to do today is talk about the National Resource Center for In-Home Services very briefly. And the center is one of a number of training and technical assistance funded by the Children's Bureau. And it has provided services to different jurisdictions and tribes over the past few years. As you can tell from the name, In-Home Services, the focus of this particular resource center has been on safety for children, youth, and families within their homes, within their communities, with also an effort to look at preventing out-of-home placement where possible. Next slide, please. The Resource Center has had the privilege of working with the state of Delaware for the past couple of years on their development and implementation of differential response. And what's of particular interest at this point in time is that Delaware has begun their initiative into differential response by utilizing a specialized family assessment and intervention response targeting families with adolescents coming into the system through the Child Protection Services entrance. Next slide, please. So the objective of what we're going to try to do today is Linda Shannon with Delaware will be talking about the development and implementation of FAIR, the Family Assessment and Intervention Response, talk about how it's evolved through the system, and we'll provide some early outcomes on the work that's being done with teenagers. Next slide, please. Prior to giving you an introduction or introducing Linda to you, I want to provide some very brief context around what is differential response. And appreciate that some of the audience may be well aware of differential response and others might not be. The information I'm going to share is brief. So I would like to suggest that if you have interest in further information about differential response, I would suggest that you Google Quality Improvement Center for Differential Response. That's a website that will provide you quite a bit of information. Moving along, in the mid-1990s in the state of Missouri, was the first, I think, major initiative on differential response, or alternative response, as some called it then. And there has been a consistent growth in the delivery of differential response systems across the country. And this was enhanced, I think, in 2010 when the federal government modified the Child Abuse and Prevention and Treatment Act to require differential response as part of the protective services in each state. The interesting part is the federal government's definition of differential response is very, very fluid or flexible. So I suppose on the positive side, this allows people to states to design and do what they want that fits into their particular jurisdiction. And the flip side of that would be there's a lot of variability, so sometimes it's hard to know what we're talking about. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. One of the simplest ways to look at what is a differential response system is to consider that historically the response in Child Protective Services has been linear. Reports accepted and there's an investigation. What we move to under differential response is that the reports get accepted, but now agencies have choices about how to respond, and they respond in a way that's proportional to the report that's being received. Next slide, please. Agencies, public child welfare agencies, receive many reports about concerns about the safety and well-being of children. The agency's first tact is to see whether or not the report that's been received reaches a threshold to be considered a valid report of maltreatment. If it doesn't, under a differential response system, the agency may elect to have a Pathway 1 response, which is either provided by the agency or a community agency, to provide a voluntary outreach to families to see if any of their needs or challenges could be met by the project or by the community. Coming back to the agency decision point, if the agency makes the decision that the report is valid, it now has a choice about how to respond. Pathway 2 response would be a family assessment. Pathway 3 response would be an investigative response. Generally, they're different in that a family assessment response does not require a finding of maltreatment, and generally, under Pathway 2, the kinds of reports that are sent there appear to have less vulnerability for the safety of the child. So a lot of people talk about being lower risk kinds of reports, whereas Pathway 3 continues to be the investigative response that focuses on such reports as sex abuse, egregious harm, reports from foster care facilities and child care homes, those sorts of things. So today we're going to be looking at a Pathway 2 response from Delaware. It is a highly specialized Pathway 2 in that it targets a very specific population. Linda Shannon will be presenting the information for Delaware. And I'm really pleased to introduce Linda. She's an MSW from Pennsylvania, and she has been the bright light of Delaware in terms of focusing their work around differential response and helping the system to move forward. She has been with the Delaware system for approaching 40 years and has worked there as both a caseworker, a supervisor, and an administrator, and has been recognized by a number of organizations for her outstanding performance in doing her work in the state of Delaware. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Linda.
Thanks, Rob, and I would like to say good afternoon to everyone, or good morning, as Rob said earlier. For those of you who attended the National Differential Response Conference in Vail last October, a panel from Delaware that included Rob did a presentation about FAIR. Today's presentation will review some of that information and then bring our story up to date. So in speaking about the evolution of differential response in Delaware, I'm going to talk a little about Delaware, our enabling legislation, how differential response grew, initial outcomes, and the future of FAIR. Next slide, please. A little about Delaware, and the pun is intended. You can drive from the northern border to the southern border in 2 hours. Our population is less than 1 million. Our capital, Dover, is in Kent County in the middle of the state, but the largest city is Wilmington, and it is located in Newcastle County. 2 of our 4 regional offices are located in Newcastle County, with 1 regional office in each of the other 2 counties. All statewide reports of child abuse, that includes intrafamilial, extrafamilial, and institutional abuse, are reported to the Division of Family Services, or DFS,
but the extrafamilial are screened out and forwarded to law enforcement. I also wanted to mention that the DFS has a centralized intake, and we also have 3 shifts and weekend holiday staff. Next slide, please. The Delaware Division of Family Services began a journey in 2011 to create a best practice model that balances safety, stability, and permanence. Outcomes Matter, Enhancing Practice and Transforming Lives consists of 17 major initiatives to 1. Improve decision-making throughout the continuum of services, 2. Engage better with families and children, and 3. Strengthen our infrastructure. Outcomes Matter is an exciting and unique collaboration of public and private agencies, foundations, and consultants that includes the Annie E. Casey Foundation, the National Resource Center for In-Home Services, as Rob said, and the National Council on Crime and Delinquency's Children Research Center. Next slide, please. This slide provides detail about the 3 approaches we are using to developing our new practice model. A handout is available that explains each of the strategies discussed on this slide. The core of this practice model is how do we make decisions? We have implemented structured decision-making throughout our continuum of services and team decision-making as 2 of these strategies. 2 others that are not shown on this slide is the Consultation and Information Framework developed by Sue Lorbach and Red Teams for deciding whether a case goes to the investigation pathway or FAIR pathway. And Rob will be able to respond to questions about the framework and Red Teams during the question and answer period at the end of the presentation. Of course, the decision piece can't stand on its own. It needs to be embedded within ways that we engage with children and families. Engaging children and families gets us better information to use in our decision-making, and it makes it more likely that families will work with us as we carry out those decisions, participating in services and making real changes. FAIR, safety organized practice, and family search and engagement are 3 significant changes we are making in Delaware to engage families better. And finally, surrounding this work, we need larger organizational supports, things like training and coaching for workers to improve the way we work with families, and our new FACWIS system, Family and Child Tracking System, or FACS-2. Next slide, please. On the last slide, I mentioned that FAIR and safety organized practice were important strategies for improving family engagement. And to give you some historical context, Andrew Turnell and Steve Edwards created the Signs of Safety approach and wrote the book, Signs of Safety. Rob Sawyer and Sue Lorbach brought the Signs of Safety and Structured Decision-Making system to Olmsted County, Minnesota. And Sue also developed and operationalized risk statements. And as I said before, she also developed the Consultation and Information Framework. So safety organized practice integrates signs of safety and structured decision-making. Safety organized practice is the practice that supports inclusion of the voices of all the family members, which optimizes the validity of the structured decision-making tools. Safety organized practice also supports ways for the structured decision-making assessments to be integrated into conversations and planning with the families so that there is a robust and comprehensive consideration and inclusion of safety, risk, and protective factors. The Division of Family Services began training all staff at all levels about safety organized practice last fall, and we will complete the training on the 12 modules by Thanksgiving. Safety organized practice is a critical part of FAIR implementation and Outcomes Matter in general. Next slide, please. The Division of Family Services had statutory authority to conduct family assessments since the enactment of the Child Abuse Prevention Act of 1997. Our law was based on the Missouri statute. However, there was a lack of political will to implement FAIR because in large part the state was extremely focused on safety. That focus was almost exclusively on physical safety. As the state has been exposed to trainings on trauma, it helped move the understanding that safety also needed to include emotional and psychological safety. Then, when the research on the National Survey of Child and Adolescent Well-Being was released, it helped child welfare agencies better frame the negative outcomes for children who had long stays or had grown up in foster care. So this empowered our agency to help system partners who promote the need for evidence-based interventions in child welfare see that there is evidence for differential response implementation. Next slide, please. As Rob stated, CAPTA was reauthorized in December 2010. And it required each state governor to assure differential response was implemented, although, as Rob also said, the feds did not prescribe how differential response was to be implemented. The Division of Family Services decided to study what the pool of potential differential response cases could be by administratively reviewing accepted hotline reports for the month of December 2010. Following this, a differential response proposal was developed that included guiding principles, recommended family assessment case types, a protocol for cases to flow, a data review, a budget, benefits, and next steps. Then we sought external support that included our cabinet secretary, the legislated and governor-appointed oversight group called the Child Protection Accountability Commission, our advisory council, and other partners. A $750,000 budget initiative was developed and approved, and it happened to be the Children's Department's sole budget initiative for FY13. We also applied for and received approval for technical assistance from the National Resource Center for In-Home Services, and we were very, very fortunate to receive help from Rob Sawyer and Karen Kaplan. We convened a work group that had a diverse membership, including internal division and department staff, as well as external stakeholders. We also had assistance and participation from consultants from the National Resource Center for In-Home Services, Tamara Horn from the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and the Administration for Children and Families Region 3 Program Specialist Tom Strouderman. He also attended our meetings routinely. This was the beginning of our unique collaboration. We had 4 full-day meetings from March to June. The work group was structured with a plan to cover identified topics and considerable time for discussion and planning. Presentations on identified populations were presented to the work group, along with presentations by the Annie E. Casey Foundation and Dr. Tom Sexton. The work group also reviewed various kinds of agency statistics involving reported and substantiated types of maltreatment. Recommendations were made to the agency leadership at the conclusion of the work group, and a report summarizing all of this work was written by Karen Kaplan and is available upon request. Next slide, please. Around the time we began exploring how we could implement differential response, the Annie E. Casey Foundation came to Delaware, and they became a strong advocate for implementing family assessment. To better inform their work in Delaware, Casey did an evaluation, and they particularly did a statistical analysis of children in care. 41% of the out-of-home care population was teens, and since 79% of the teens entering care were entering care as teens, it suggested something else other than traditional child maltreatment was contributing to the phenomenon. Casey also determined that roughly 40% of Delaware's teens were not achieving permanency within 2 years of entering care. So to respond to the issues of teens in care, Casey identified promising initiatives preventing teen entry. And this was based on their interviews with national experts, reviews of secondary research on preventing teen entry, and visits to sites, 5 sites with promising practices. So one of the key practices that Casey identified for us was an approach by Southwest Key programs called Family Keys. Next slide, please. The Differential Response Work Group recommended that the family assessment community provider target families with adolescents at risk of entering out-of-home placement. The work group also recommended agency leadership consider the options for expansion of differential response in Delaware to include the development of a Pathway 1 response for selected screened-out reports and a Pathway 2 family assessment response for work with selected youth and parents internally. Although Pathway 2 was not originally planned, you will learn how it evolved. A request for proposals was issued in August 2012, and the RFP panel selected Children and Families First to be awarded the family assessment and intervention response contract. And Children and Families First, incidentally, was one of the first community-based child welfare agencies in Delaware. It was founded in 1884. Next slide, please. So this slide shows our unique public and private collaboration. And you can see the Division of Family Services at the top, of course, the National Resource Center, Annie E. Casey, Children's Research Center, Southwest Keys, and, of course, Children and Families First. Next slide, please. So the startup activities included Children and Families First hiring staff. They decided to put 3 staff in Newcastle and 1 each in Kent County and Sussex County. We required that the clinical director and fair supervisor attend the National Differential Response Conference in Nevada in November of 2012. All new CFF fair staff are required to complete the division's core training. And we also asked that the fair staff attend a trip to Fort Collins, Colorado with selected division staff in February of 2013 to learn more about the family assessment process and particularly to shadow workers providing family assessment services in the field. Pathway 2, contracted fair with Children and Families First, launched on March 4th, 2013. Next slide, please. This slide shows our initial referral criteria. And you can see ages 13 to 18, we began with priority 2 responses, which are within 72 hours, and priority 3, which are within 10 calendar days. Risk of abuse, neglect, abandonment and lockout, emotional abuse and neglect. And of course, many of the cases come in as something else, but they're often, the genesis is parent-child conflict. The entry criteria was later revisited to add priority 1 responses that occur within 24 hours, dependency cases involving discharges from our sister divisions, youth rehabilitative services, and prevention and behavioral health. And more recently, we added 11 and 12-year-olds. Multidisciplinary cases involving law enforcement and the Department of Justice are required by statute to be investigated. So this slide discusses the CFF FAIR components, and we have family assessment. Family assessment is conducted for all cases. A safety assessment is conducted in the home for all children in the family during the initial face-to-face contact. Of course, services should be provided to families without outstanding safety threats. When the safety assessment indicates the children are safe or safe with a child safety agreement, Children and Families First conducts a risk assessment when they have gathered enough information to complete it. The CAFIS is also completed for the identified teen, and the CAFIS is a professionally rated measurement tool that looks at 8 life domains and is designed to assess the level of functioning in children and adolescents. During a routine interview, the FAIR caseworker completes the CAFIS in order to determine the youth's strengths, goals, and problematic behaviors. A higher CAFIS score indicates a higher level of service is needed, such as functional family therapy, which I will discuss more in a minute. Following the safety and risk assessments, some families may not require further services if there are no outstanding safety threats and the risk level is low to moderate. So in other words, we do not want the contracted FAIR providing more services than we would provide internally to a family that we investigated. Next slide, please. The Family Keys model provides short-term crisis intervention and referrals to community-based programs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The length of service for Level 1 is 45 to 60 days, and in addition to the services listed on this slide for the intervention response part, flex funds are also used. Next slide, please. FFT is a short-term counseling program with 3 phases, and relapse prevention is also known as generalization. FFT works primarily with 11 to 18-year-old youth who have been referred for behavioral or emotional problems by the juvenile justice, mental health, school, or child welfare systems. And Children and Families at First is working with Dr. Tom Sexton, who continues to develop, adapt, and disseminate this model. Most families can be served with 12 to 20 weekly sessions of FFT. Next slide. So the work processes ran the gamut. So as the slide says, we set up regular meetings in the beginning on a monthly basis to develop, implement, and monitor the work processes. They ran the gamut. So for example, how were we going to transfer the cases to the contractor? We wanted to develop an after-hours contact schedule for any reports that would come in at night or on weekends. We also needed to establish contacts for problem resolution. So these routine meetings included key internal staff, report line staff, for example, and they also included key staff of Children and Families First. Next slide, please. A formal comprehensive contract monitoring was conducted by the Division of Family Services in March 2014, and the Annie E. Casey Foundation simultaneously conducted its own one-year review of FAIR. And the statistical outcome measures I'm going to discuss were compiled by Casey's Tamara Horn. As you can see on the slide, it says 365 teen youth cases had been referred to FAIR and needed assessments. Of the 365 referred, 36 families declined FAIR and were returned to the Division of Family Services for investigation. So Children and Families First completed 329 assessments, and 48 cases, or 15%, were sent back to the division for safety and or risk issues, or were closed due to a lack of safety or risk issues. So overall, 281 teen youth cases, or 85%, were open and kept beyond assessment. And of those 281 cases, 81% were open in Level 1 family keys only, 17% were open in FFT only, and 2% were open in both. Now regarding teen entry, the last bullet, 10 youth who had been referred to FAIR eventually entered division placements. However, 7 of these youth were returned the next day or within days because the family refused to work with FAIR or there were safety or risk concerns. Now, there's been other types of monitoring. As I said, we did a formal monitoring. The Children's Research Center has also conducted fidelity case reviews of FAIR cases, just as they have with the division's cases following implementation in investigation. And in addition to the core training that I mentioned earlier, FAIR staff are also required to attend all the safety organized practice training, and in fact they have a couple staff who also co-train with DFS. FAIR staff is also required to attend other outcomes matter training, and included in those fidelity case reviews by the Children's Research Center, they're looking at the utilization of the safety organized practice techniques. Next slide, please. So earlier I mentioned a trip we took to Fort Collins, Colorado, and this visit was pivotal in the development of FAIR and safety organized practice within our agency. The trip included the report line administrator and supervisors and workers from 2 adolescent units that we have in Newcastle County, among others. After this trip, there was strong motivation by the division staff to do an internal FAIR pilot. A Pathway 2 internal FAIR pilot began taking FAIR cases on June 10, 2013. And each of those units is comprised of 5 caseworkers, and initially all of those workers did both investigation and FAIR. Very recently, specific workers have been identified to only do FAIR, and of course it is possible for cases to flip from a FAIR case to an investigation and vice versa. Our hope is for the same worker to keep that case. If a case would need a multidisciplinary investigation, the case would move to a different worker. Next slide, please. So we have the 2 components with the internal FAIR, family assessment and intervention response. Internally, the family assessment components are the structured decision-making, safety assessment, and risk assessment. And the length of service is 60 days with the ability to extend to 90 days. Most cases that have needed services so far have been handled on a short-term basis. Cases that result in out-of-home care now or require more intensive services are transferred to a treatment unit, but in the future that may change. FFT services are also available for pilot cases as well as other cases in our agency through a different Children and Families First FFT funding source. However, there is usually a long waiting list for FFT through that source. And interestingly, our evaluation of the contracted FAIR showed that timely access to FFT results in better engagement and better outcomes. And regarding outcome measures for internal FAIR, due to the target population focusing only on adolescents and our desire to grow CFF FAIR first, the division's FAIR pilot numbers have been small. Between June 10, 2013 and December 31, 2013, there were only 58 referrals. Next slide, please. Safety organized practice encourages a balanced assessment that looks at 3 basic questions. What is working well? What are your worries? And what are the next steps? So in the interest of parallel process, I'm going to frame the next 3 slides using this process. And these are not inclusive, what you see on the screen. They're just some of our key findings. So we did find that FAIR is keeping you safe and preventing placements. Since the FAIR workers, the contracted FAIR workers only do FAIR and not investigation, they have very, very frequent contact with family. As I stated a minute ago, timely access to the FFT results in better engagement. And they've been a very responsive partner. And in terms of that responsiveness, one example that I can provide you is that as part of our outcomes measures initiatives, one of the things we implemented was team decision-making. So before any child can enter foster care or be discharged from foster care, we have a team, family team meeting with trained facilitators, division staff that are trained facilitators. Children and Families First FAIR asked, they had participated in some of the division's team decision-making meetings, and these were cases they participated in after they had returned the case to DFS because placement appeared to be looming on the horizon. They asked us if they could have access to our facilitators and have the meetings while they are still active with the case to prevent sending the case back to the division. So that's just one example of their responsiveness, but all throughout this process, whenever we've made tweaks to referral criteria or adding the Priority 1 response, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, they've been very accommodating. Next slide. So as with any new program, there have been growing pains, and in safety organized practice lingo, these were our worries. The nature of Delaware statute regarding the types of reports requiring multidisciplinary investigations is restrictive on the referral criteria. Our statute specifies approximately 40 types of cases that must be reported to law enforcement and the Department of Justice. The second bullet refers to staff turnover. Obviously, backup is limited when there are only 5 workers, and there are times when the FAIR supervisor or program manager makes field responses herself. However, despite this limitation, it has never inhibited our ability to send referrals to the contracted provider. The third bullet about the information system, Contracted FAIR has 2 different databases for levels 1 and 2. And level 2 FFT changed databases in midstream. And of course, the division SACWIS is a third database. So realizing all evidence-based models use their own proprietary client information systems, this may be something that others may want to, other jurisdictions, should factor into their data collection and reporting when they're planning to implement a system such as we have done with a contracted provider. By starting FAIR with an external contracted provider, we may have made it more difficult for the division staff to understand or appreciate that differential response is a fundamental child welfare approach. And we did it that way because we were in the middle of the Great Recession and we needed to provide front-end relief without growing state government. We had a specific contract amount which could be cut if funds were reduced. And if we had implemented FAIR by adding state positions, we would have had those immediate salary costs and overhead costs as well as long-term pension and health care costs. So it was much more financially feasible to do it externally given the difficult budget times. Next slide, please. Regarding a Pathway 1 for screened out reports that Rob discussed at the beginning of the presentation, a memorandum of understanding was signed by the director in November 2013 for a pilot with the Infant Caregiver Project at the University of Delaware and Delaware's BEST Project. And this program provided triage to help assess and connect families with infants and toddlers to an array of evidence-based programs in Delaware. This also helped the providers recruit families for research studies on a voluntary basis. There was no requirement to participate. And it was a no-cost way for our agency to help connect at-risk families with community-based services without further burdening the division staff. So it was a real win-win for everybody. But the really big news is that our director has approved statewide expansion of FAIR internally, and the expansion will move beyond the adolescent target population. And that expansion work group began meeting during the latter part of 2013. Regional and statewide implementation teams are in place. System-wide implementation is planned for late in 2014. And then finally, our director has also been working with Dr. Sexton on a plan for agency staff to be trained to provide FFT internally. Next slide, please. So Delaware has come a long way in less than 2 years. In the future, we hope to become a fully matured differential response system with the majority of our cases going to FAIR. And with that, we hope to be able to shift our funding to provide services to intact families and lessen entries into out-of-home care. Next slide, please. This slide provides all the contact information for the various collaborators that I've discussed during the presentation. And I want to thank the National Resource Center for giving Delaware Division of Family Services the opportunity to talk about our FAIR programs.
This brings us to our question and answer session of today's webinar. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our operating assistant, who will give us some information about how you can ask a question.
Once again, you can press star 1 on your telephone keypad. A voice prompt will indicate when your line is open to ask a question. And if you're using a speakerphone, please make sure to pick up your handset prior to asking a question. You also can type your question in the chat box. And we'll pause a moment and allow everyone an opportunity to ask their question.
Okay, it seems like we also have questions that are coming through live chat. So if someone could go ahead and ask a question over the operated assistant, that will give us time to queue up our questions via the live chat.
If you submitted a question and are willing to ask it over the phone, please press star 1.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and ask a question through the live chat, and the question is, how does CQI enable you to improve and sustain FAIR in Delaware?
Well, we have a quality assurance program manager who we actually have developed a quality assurance tool for internal FAIR, but that has not yet been implemented because the numbers have been so low. So internally, it hasn't had an impact yet, but we have, as I said, done a major monitoring of the contracted FAIR, and Annie Casey Foundation also did their own evaluation of external FAIR, which supported continuing external FAIR.
Okay, that seems to be all the questions we have via chat at this moment. Can we go ahead and open up the phone lines again, and then I will check back, if you could check back with me on additional questions.
And once again, that is star 1 on your telephone keypad. If you're using a mute function, please make sure that is released, or pick up your handset prior to pressing the corresponding digits.
Okay, while folks are getting queued, I actually have 2 more questions. The one question is, what does FFT stand for again? And if you can also share the CQI tool.
So FFT stands for Functional Family Therapy, and I probably would be able to share the tool, and I guess I would provide that to the Resource Center to post.
Yes, that would definitely work, Linda. We can add that to the handouts for today's webinar once you get that approved.
Okay, thank you.
And then the next question does have to do, again, with FAIR, and the question is, if you could please clarify who are the FAIR members.
The FAIR members, again, are the collaborating agencies, or the Division of Family Services, the National Resource Center for In-Home Services, the Annie Casey Foundation, the National Council on Crime and Delinquency's Children Research Center, who is instructing us about structured decision-making and safety organized practice, and then our contractor, Children and Families First. Those are the collaborators.
Thank you, Linda. We have one more question while folks are getting things queued up. Actually, there's 2 more questions. One is, please talk a little bit more about the response times. Is it 3 days up to 10 days for initial contact with the families, or is it 3 days or 10 days response time frame?
Okay, I'd be happy to address that. The response times for an investigation in Delaware are what we call a Priority 1 response, and that's within 24 hours. A Priority 2 response is within 72 hours, and a Priority 3 response is within 10 calendar days. And we are requiring contracted fare to follow the priority response time frames. But what we found by monitoring them is that they're actually responding to everything within 24 hours by phone or in person.
Okay, and as you mentioned the monitoring process, another question has come in about that, and it says, does your implementation team for FAIR still meet to monitor and evaluate FAIR practice?
Yes, we do still meet routinely. As I said in the beginning, we met on a monthly basis, and actually we were having internal meetings to talk about how to process things involving the contractor, and then we would have a joint meeting with the contractor. About 6 months into it, we decided that we were going to give the supervisors from the DFS Adolescent FAIR pilot units an opportunity to meet with a FAIR contractor on their own, and we changed the meetings to bi-monthly. But we continue to meet internally to be able to expand internally, and we have also continued to meet with the contractor on a routine basis. And we try to do those meetings on the same days because a lot of the participants overlap.
Okay, great. Thanks, Linda. Camille, do you have any questions on the phone? If not, I have a couple more questions coming through live chat.
We do have a question on the phone.
Hi, this is Ann Exline-Starr. I'm the Court Improvement Coordinator for Family Court in Delaware. I just recently joined, so forgive my questions if they've already been answered or they're overly simplistic. But I wanted to ask Linda, why do you think the rates for usage of FAIR are so low? I believe you said there were 58 people who were part of the system. Maybe I misheard that.
It's low in the internal FAIR, but it's not low with the external FAIR because we wanted to maximize the use of our contract. So we've made a real effort to forward as many of the cases meeting the criteria to them as possible. So the downside of that was that it kept our pilot units with low numbers.
Right. How many pilot units are there?
There's the 2 adolescent units in Newcastle.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And so, Linda, just kind of continuing on the questions about the FAIR model, there is a question about your outcomes, and we have someone who was wondering how the outcomes for FAIR compare with outcomes from the investigative response.
Well, that's interesting. In terms of children entering care, to be honest, the division, since we've implemented all of these outcomes matter initiatives, we've actually experienced a reduction of entry into care all the way around. And unfortunately, I don't have those statistics at my fingertips, but overall we have experienced a reduction, but we've been particularly successful focusing on these teens.
Okay, great. And I do have the contact information for the person asking that question, so if there's any follow-up that you would like to provide, I can provide her contact information as well. There's another question, and this just has to do with your implementation theory. and we had someone who was just wondering, how did you, kind of come upon this particular implementation theory for FAIR?
And I'm not sure I'm crystal clear about the question that's being asked about. I'm not sure whether they're wondering why we chose the teens first, which I think I explained that the work group made the recommendation about the teens. If they're really wanting to know why we isolated a target population, because of the significant emphasis in the state of Delaware on physical safety of children, there's a lot of concern about, that we would be able to still maintain child safety, and I think we wanted to start with a population that would be the least vulnerable. That was one of the other factors in this, and generally older children are able to defend themselves better. So, and we also wanted to just grow this small, a little bit at a time, because to reassure people, our partners, that we were going to be keeping children safe. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we do the safety assessment and risk assessment with the FAIR cases as well.
And speaking of your safety in your risk assessments, there's a question just asking if you could describe a little bit more the differences between the safety assessment and your risk assessment under the FAIR response.
Well, they're actually the same as they would be under with an investigation. The safety assessment looks at imminent harm, and risk is looking at, danger, the future danger in the home. So they're actually very similar. You're using the same tools, and they're looking at the same issues.
Okay.
Our tools let me just add, our tools actually are online at the Child Welfare Information Gateway. Both our intake manual, structured decision-making intake manual, and our structured decision-making safety and risk assessments manual.
Great. We'll make sure to add a link to those resources so that folks have an opportunity to access those as well. Camille, do you have any other questions online? I have one other question on chat, and then we can go ahead and start to close out.
We have no other questions in the queue.
Okay. So, Linda, there is actually another question that just came through, so we'll try to get to this as quickly as possible. So let's see. The question is, I think this is when you were talking about the teens who may have charges. Someone wants to know how they are incorporated into the process.
At one point in the presentation, I discussed that we enlarged the referral criteria to include dependency cases, and we have, and I mentioned our sister divisions, Youth Rehabilitative Services and the Division of Prevention and Behavioral Health, which used to be called Child Mental Health. But frequently, children that are housed within Youth Rehabilitative Services, either in short-term detention, but more often in the long-term incarceration facilities and in residential treatment, frequently when those youth are ready for discharge, the families are not very willing to take them back home. So we've been referring those cases to the contracted FAIR to see if they can work with the families to get those children to return home.
Okay, great. And I just wanted to clarify, the person who was asking the question about the implementation theory just really wanted to know if you had a particular implementation theory that you use for implementing FAIR. So I don't know if your answer would be policy different or not?
We actually did have an approach that we used for safety organized practice, for example. The approach we used for safety organized practice was early adopters. So we had a small group of people that were interested in safety organized practice, got trained in safety organized practice, and as I said, that included some of the contracted FAIR staff, and then those people have been helping to train. But with respect specifically to FAIR, I don't know that I can isolate an approach other than what I described during the presentation.
Okay, great.
Or a theory.
I wonder if Rob could do that. Not necessarily a theory, but our approach to implementation.
No, I think that the work group designed what they wanted. They took a look at what the evidence was that Casey was presenting from their study in terms of the results of the work with teenagers and their look around the country in terms of what were some promising evidence-based initiatives for working with teens in this population. And so there was the search for what's out there that might be helpful to put together and to use in Delaware. So Delaware did look at those kinds of designs and picked the one that they thought, actually the one I think the Casey Foundation was recommending based on its study and how well it fit then with the population. So I hope that's being responsive to the question. So I think the theory was, what do we know that's helpful and works? And then sorting through that and looking at can we implement that through a community provider? And the answer to that was yes. And the community provider also engages and works with both functional family therapy and the Family Keys people, the originators of both of those, to make sure that there's fidelity in the model that they're implementing. So I hope that helps.
Thanks, Rob. Camille, are there any other questions online? I have 2 other live chat questions that we could move right into.
We have no further questions in the queue.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and ask these last couple questions. And this has to do with how your safety outcomes are measured, and is it through re-referral or child removal rates?
We have extensive outcome measures in the contract, which I am willing to share with if you wanted to post them. And one of the things we do look at is referrals. And let me find that specifically. Re-reports. So we, between March 4th of 2013 and March 31st of 2014, approximately 60 youth who had been previously referred to or served by Children and Families First FAIR out of this 365 youth over the same period were re-reported to the division's hot report line. And some of those calls came from the contracted FAIR staff themselves, and we included those in our numbers, and some came from reporters outside of contracted FAIR. So we did do an examination of those re-reports, and we were able to provide information on about 50 of the 60 cases. And what it showed was that out of the 50 reports that we could nail down, 20 were made on the same day or within a few days of the original referral to contracted FAIR, and many of those were made by FAIR themselves because the youth or the families refused to participate, or the safety and risk assessments were too high, so that the division needed to conduct an investigation. 16 of the 50 were unsubstantiated cases. No further services were required or erroneous. And only 4 of the cases that had been served by the contracted FAIR were re-reported at a later date and substantiated, so very low substantiation on the re-reports. Again, I can make the summary report by any EKC available if someone would like to review that.
Yes, great, Linda. What we could do is add that to our handouts, if that works, and get that posted to the NRC for In-Home Services website.
Okay.
And then I think I have a final question. There has been a lot of questions, which is great. I know you covered a lot of information in the presentation that you just provided. But this is a question that has to do with engagement practices. And the question is, have you run across anything in your development of FAIR that directly connects child safety to engagement practice in terms of outcomes? It's been difficult to find a direct link between engagement practice and child safety, although most of the research makes assumptions that they are linked.
Yeah, and I actually would feel more comfortable referring the person who's asking this question directly to the Children's Research Center. I provided Heather Meitner's name at the conclusion of my presentation on one of the slides. But I think if you were to talk to staff, they would tell you that many of the techniques that are used through safety organized practice, the contract affairs staff as well as our internal staff in investigation and the FAIR pilot units would tell you that the techniques we're learning through safety organized practice definitely strengthen safety, using there's techniques, something called 3 houses, building networks for family networks and things like that. We just feel that it's been a real plus with the families we're working with. But again, I'd prefer the Children's Research Center. They are a very research-based organization. They could probably provide much better detail about that than I could.
And I did go ahead and put that slide up for more information. And was that Heather Meitner with the CRC that you had just referred to?
Yes, Heather Meitner, yes.
Okay, great. And so her contact information is here on the screen and then also included in the PowerPoint presentations that will be posted on the NRC for In-Home Services website. So you're welcome to access her email address either of those 2 ways. So at this point, Camille, if there isn't any other questions in line, then we can go ahead and turn it over to Lisa Diano.
We have no further questions, so I'd like to turn the call over to Lisa Diano for closing remarks.
Hi, this is Lisa Diano. I'm the Project Director for the National Research Center for In-Home Services. I wanted to thank you for joining us today. And thank especially Linda Shannon and Rob Sawyer for a great presentation. One thing I might add is I know that Rob and Sue Lorbach did some of their work in Olmsted County looking at the very question of family engagement strategies and outcomes. And I think we can figure out a way to link you to some presentations they've made in other locations that could give you some guidance on that. Usually at this time of the presentation, I provide some information about how you could get resources from the National Research Center for In-Home Services. It's a sad time for me to say that our 5-year funding cycle is ending next week, and so we won't have a National Research Center for In-Home Services. The Children's Bureau has decided to move to, rather than topic-specific resource centers, moving to sort of a unified center, one for states, one for tribes. They'll be announcing the awardees for that, I'm sure, quite soon because the period's coming up, and then there'll be a transition period, during which time, if you're a state or a tribe, it's really important to be in touch with your federal regional officer about any resources that you might need for technical assistance. And then after that time, the new centers will come up, and I'm sure there'll be lots of outreach to folks about that. Cynthia, if you could, I do want to say that the website will our website will continue to be active for some time, and then when it deactivates, all the materials will move to our home location. So if Cynthia, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, Our home base for the NRC for in-home services is at the University of Iowa School of Social Work. And we have a long-standing center of over 35 years, which is also called the National Resource Center for Family-Centered Practice. We've been doing this kind of doing family-centered work for a long time, and we'll continue to do so. If you need more information or assistance about what you heard today or any of the programs, please feel free to contact me. If you have your PowerPoint and you pull it up, that's a link in there under National Resource Center that will send you directly to our website. I'd certainly also be happy to refer you to any services you need. We do offer services at through our center as well, and so we'll be very happy to assist. We've been very honored and privileged to have among our consultants Karen Kaplan and Rob Sawyer, and it's just been a great privilege to get a chance to work not only with them, but to work with states like Delaware, who've done such a wonderful job of integrating best practices. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Cynthia, and the final thank you to everyone who's been a part of our 5-year project. It's been a great ride, and I wish you all the best in implementation of in-home services.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. On the behalf of the National Resource Center for In-Home Services, we want to thank you for joining today's webinar. If you have additional questions about the FAIR model or any other information about training or technical assistance, please get in contact with Lisa Diano, and her information is listed here for your convenience. Immediately following today's webinar, we will send you out a short online survey and hope that you will take the opportunity to give us your feedback. We hope that you learned something new today. This concludes today's webinar, and we want to thank you and have a great afternoon.
Once again, that does conclude today's call, and we appreciate your participation.